The walls of Jerusalem were never meant to fall. For generations, they stood as stone sentinels against the world. But tonight, the sound of their collapse echoed across the valley like thunder. Babylon had arrived. The breach was not a slow erosion. It was a violent, sudden rupture of masonry and earth. Dust choked the air, thick and gray, turning the moonlight into a sickly haze. Soldiers poured through the gaps, their iron weapons clashing against the remaining defenses in a rhythm of slaughter. High above the chaos, the temple caught the spark of the invaders' torches. Flames licked at the cedar beams, hungry and relentless. The heat grew, pushing back the night, casting long, jagged shadows against the city streets. People scrambled over broken stone, seeking paths that no longer existed. The air tasted of ash and scorched timber. Every pillar that had once defined the skyline now groaned under the weight of the fire. As the roof of the sanctuary began to sag, the reality settled over the ruins. The impenetrable had been broken. The sacred was burning. The fires were still consuming the city when the soldiers turned their attention to the living. They did not want the broken. They wanted the future of the nation. Amidst the screams and the shifting rubble, 4 young men were pulled from the shadows of a collapsing courtyard. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were the pride of the city, scholars and sons of noble blood. Yet the soldiers treated them like common livestock. Heavy iron links were hammered shut around their wrists, the metal biting into their skin. The cold weight of the chains dragged their shoulders down, a physical reminder that their autonomy had vanished in a single night. They were shoved into a line of prisoners, forced to walk past the smoldering remains of their home. Every step away from the temple was a step into a new, darker reality. They were no longer citizens of a sovereign land. They were property, marked for the long journey to a foreign capital. The soldiers barked orders, prodding them with the blunt ends of spears to keep the pace. There was no room for grief, only the rhythmic clanking of iron against iron. The city was a memory now, replaced by an endless, shimmering horizon of heat. The desert stretched out like a furnace floor, the sand fine and abrasive, finding its way into every seam of their skin. Each day began before the sun crested the dunes, the soldiers driving the captives forward with the relentless rhythm of a drum. Water was rationed to a few swallows, leaving their throats parched. The sun hammered down, turning the air into a shimmering veil that distorted the distance. Daniel walked with his head bowed, not in submission, but to shield his eyes from the glare. The soldiers mocked them, tossing scraps of foreign bread and demanding they sing. When the others faltered, their spirits wilting under the relentless exposure, Daniel remained steady. He focused on the horizon, not as a boundary, but as a space where he could anchor his thoughts. He recited the laws of his fathers in his mind, syllable by syllable, building a fortress of memory that no chain could penetrate. The resolve in Daniel grew sharper, a quiet, unyielding fire. The horizon finally broke. It did not end in sand, but in a wall of brilliant, impossible blue. The gates of Babylon rose like a mountain of lapis lazuli, shimmering under the sun with a depth that seemed to swallow the light. As the captives were led through the massive archway, the scale of the city crushed the last remnants of their hope. The streets were paved with glazed brick, wide enough for chariots to race, flanked by temples that reached toward the clouds. The air here was different, heavy, with the scent of incense, roasted meat, and the metallic tang of wealth. It was a world of sensory overload, designed to overwhelm the senses and diminish the spirit. Thousands of voices hummed in a language they did not understand, a cacophony of commerce and power that made their own existence feel small. They were being ushered into a machine of empire, a place where their history and their god were viewed as nothing more than dust. Ashpenaz stood before them in a hall of polished stone, his presence as rigid as the pillars surrounding him. He held a scroll of heavy parchment, his eyes scanning the 4 captives with the clinical detachment of a merchant counting inventory. He did not ask for their consent. He simply began to read. The names they had carried since birth were dismissed with a flick of his wrist. One by one, he assigned them new labels, sounds that tasted of foreign gods and strange loyalties. When he reached Daniel, the scribe paused, his quill hovering over the ink. He spoke the name Belteshazzar, a title intended to bind the young man to the protection of a Babylonian deity. The sound hung in the air, a cold weight. Daniel stood motionless, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the floor. He heard the name and recognized the attempt to overwrite his soul. The ritual was complete, the ink was dry, and the empire believed it had succeeded. They had changed the label, but they had not touched the man underneath. The transition from the renaming ritual to the royal banquet was immediate. Servants moved through the halls, carrying silver platters, piled high with roasted meats, rich breads, and flagons of fermented wine. The aroma was intoxicating, a deliberate temptation, meant to soften the resolve of the captives. This was not merely a meal, it was a communion with the gods of Babylon. Every portion had been consecrated at the temple altars before reaching the table. Daniel watched as the other youths reached for the offerings, their hunger momentarily overriding their hesitation. He looked at the steward, whose eyes were fixed on them, waiting for the first sign of compliance. The stakes were clear. To eat was to accept the authority of the empire and the gods it served. To refuse was to insult the king. Daniel stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not look at the food. He looked directly at the man in charge. He requested a simple alternative, knowing that this single act of defiance had just placed his life in the balance. The steward stared at the water and the pulse, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had expected a plea for mercy, not a challenge to the laws of the palace. He accepted the terms, but his eyes promised swift retribution if the experiment failed. For 10 days, the world narrowed to the rhythm of their choice. While the rest of the court indulged in the heavy, spiced offerings of the king, Daniel and his companions retreated to the quiet corners of their quarters. They consumed only the water and the simple harvest of the earth. The first few days passed in a blur of hunger and uncertainty. The physical ache of the body was a constant reminder of the risk they had taken. They watched the servants pass by with trays of meat, the scent lingering in the air like a taunt. Every morning, the steward arrived, his gaze sharp and searching, looking for the first sign of weakness or collapse. He expected their strength to wane, their resolve to crumble under the weight of the royal diet they had abandoned. But as the 10th day approached, the expected decline never came. The silence in their room was not one of defeat, but of anticipation. They stood at the edge of the final hour, waiting for the steward to return and witness the result of their faith. The heavy door creaked open, and the steward stepped into the room, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He had come to document their failure. He stopped mid-stride. Daniel and his companions stood waiting, their movements fluid and steady. The steward looked past them, expecting to see the hollowed eyes and trembling limbs of men who had starved themselves for 10 days. Instead, he found clarity. Their skin was clear, their eyes sharp, and their posture held the vigor of men who had feasted on the finest grain. He turned his gaze to the other youths in the compound, those who had consumed the king's rich meats and heavy wines. They appeared sluggish, their faces bloated and dull from the excess of the royal table. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The steward walked toward Daniel, his fingers tracing the air as if searching for a hidden trick. He found none. There was no sign of weakness. The steward's skepticism dissolved, replaced by a sudden, sharp recognition. He stepped back, his authority effectively neutralized by the physical reality before him. The calm of the palace shattered before the sun reached its zenith. King Nebuchadnezzar did not call for a council. He summoned his wise men with a roar that echoed against the stone pillars. He stood by the window, his back to the room, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. He had seen a vision in the night, a sequence of images that left his mind reeling. Yet, when he woke, the details slipped through his fingers like sand. He turned, his eyes burning with a volatile, restless energy. He demanded the impossible. He ordered the wise men to not only interpret the dream, but to recount the vision itself. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The astrologers and sorcerers shifted, their voices trembling, as they explained that no man could reveal what the king had not spoken. Nebuchadnezzar did not listen. He paced the floor, his breathing ragged, his patience incinerated by his own pride. He issued a decree that sent a chill through the heart of the capital. If they could not produce the dream, they would be cut into pieces and their houses turned into ruins. The executioner moved to the threshold, his hand gripping the cold steel of his weapon. The heavy tread of the royal guard vibrated through the floorboards of the chamber. Daniel heard the metallic scrape of the executioner's blade against the stone wall outside. He did not run. He stepped into the path of the approaching soldiers and held up a hand, his voice steady against the rising panic of the palace. He demanded time. The guard hesitated, the weight of the king's unpredictable temper forcing a pause. Daniel turned and retreated into the silence of his private room. He shut the door, sealing out the frantic shouts of the city. Ava. The space was small, smelling of dry parchment and cooling stone. He walked to the center of the room and knelt on the cold floor. A single oil lamp burned on a low table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows that stretched toward the ceiling. He did not speak aloud. He pressed his forehead against the floor, his breathing slowing until it matched the rhythmic flicker of the light. The world outside ceased to exist. The vision surged into his mind, sharp and absolute. Daniel stood, the revelation burning in his eyes, and walked toward the door to face the blade. Daniel walked into the throne room. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the metallic tang of fear. He stopped before the dais where the king sat, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword. Daniel did not bow. He spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He described a colossus that scraped the heavens, a head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and feet of iron mixed with clay. The king leaned forward, his eyes widening as the forgotten image took shape in the air between them. Daniel continued, his tone relentless. He spoke of a stone, hewn from a mountain by no human hand, hurtling through the void. It struck the statue at its base, shattering the iron and clay into dust. The gold, silver, and bronze crumbled, swept away like chaff in a summer storm. The throne room grew deathly quiet. The king stood, his breath hitching in his throat. The arrogance that had fueled his rage only moments ago evaporated, replaced by a hollow, trembling awe. He looked at his own hands, then back at Daniel, the reality of a power greater than his empire, finally sinking into his marrow. He sank to his knees, his forehead touching the cold stone floor, and acknowledged the God of gods. The humility that had gripped the king lasted only as long as the echoes of the vision. Within months, the memory of the shattered statue was buried under a new, singular obsession. He turned his back on the God of gods and looked instead to his own reflection. On the vast, flat expanse of the plain of Dura, the earth began to groan under the weight of industry. Thousands of laborers arrived, their movements synchronized by the lash of overseers. Furnaces roared day and night, melting down the wealth of conquered nations. The air grew heavy, with the smell of scorched metal and coal smoke. Day by day, the structure rose, a jagged silhouette against the horizon. It was a monolith of pure gold, catching the sun until it burned with a light that blinded the eye. When the final plate was hammered into place, the idol stood 60 cubits high, a silent, unmoving sentinel over the plain. The decree went out across the empire. When the music played, every knee would touch the ground. The time for forced devotion had begun. The signal came as a sudden, piercing blast of horns, flutes, and harps that vibrated through the very soles of their feet. Across the plain of Dura, the reaction was instantaneous. Thousands of people collapsed in unison, a wave of bodies hitting the dust. The sound of thousands of knees striking the earth was a dull, rhythmic thud. Yet, in the center of the clearing, 3 figures remained upright. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood motionless. They did not look at the idol. They did not look at the king. They simply stood. The silence around them was heavy, a vacuum in the middle of a roaring sea. Nearby, officials stopped their prostration, their heads snapping up. The 3 men did not shift their weight. They did not flinch as the royal guards began to push through the crowd, weapons drawn. The king leaned forward from his dais, his face darkening as he realized the defiance was not a mistake, but a choice. The air grew cold with the weight of the coming confrontation. The king did not scream. He spoke in a low, jagged rasp that carried further than the music. He ordered the furnace stoked 7 times beyond its normal capacity. The laborers scrambled, dumping fuel into the maw of the kiln until the stone walls began to glow a translucent, angry red. The heat pushed outward in waves, forcing the crowd to retreat until they were huddled hundreds of yards away. The air shimmered, turning the horizon into a distorted, liquid haze. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound with heavy cord, their wrists pulled tight behind them. They were marched toward the opening. The guards tasked with the execution hesitated, shielding their faces with their forearms as the blast of heat singed their skin. The fire roared like a living thing, a hungry, white-hot vortex that consumed the oxygen in the immediate vicinity. The men were shoved forward. They did not struggle against the push. They stepped into the light. The guards gave one final violent shove, then sprinted backward to escape the searing wall of air. The 3 men fell into the center of the furnace. The flames surged upward, swallowing them whole, turning the interior into a blinding, featureless cage of light and sound. Nebuchadnezzar remained seated on his dais, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. He waited for the screams. He waited for the smell of charred remains to drift across the plain. Instead, the furnace continued to roar, but the sound changed, deepening into a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in his chest. The king leaned forward, his eyes narrowing against the blinding glare. He stood up abruptly, his chair clattering to the stone floor behind him. He took a step toward the inferno, then stopped, his mouth hanging open in a silent gasp. He turned to his counselors, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he pointed. "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The counselors stared, speechless. Within the white-hot center, the 3 men were no longer bound. They were walking. Beside them walked a 4th figure. The king's legs buckled slightly, his arrogance shattered. He stood in total silence, paralyzed by the presence of a power that defied his throne. Nebuchadnezzar found his voice, a strained command that echoed across the silent plain. He called for them to come out. The furnace fire did not die, but it parted, creating a path of cooling stone that led directly to the king's feet. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moved toward the opening. They stepped onto the grass, their movements fluid and steady. The heat that had been an invisible wall only moments before vanished, leaving behind a sudden, chilling stillness. The king's advisors and the provincial governors crowded forward, their eyes wide, scanning the men for any sign of the ordeal. There was none. No singed skin, no trace of ash. Not even the faint, lingering scent of smoke clung to them. Nebuchadnezzar stood motionless, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The power he had wielded now felt hollow. The absolute, undeniable survival of the 3 men had dismantled his pride, leaving him breathless, defeated. The silence in the palace grew heavy, a suffocating weight that Nebuchadnezzar could no longer endure. His eyes, once sharp enough to command legions, began to wander, searching for enemies that did not exist. He paced the marble halls until his feet bled, his fingers clawing at the stone walls as if trying to tear through the foundations. The transition was not sudden, but a slow, agonizing unraveling of his mind. He stopped speaking to his advisors. He stopped eating at his table, pushing away the gold platters with a guttural snarl. The court watched in terror. One night, the shift became absolute. He tore at the tapestries, his movements erratic and violent, his breath coming in animalistic gasps. He pushed past the guards, his eyes wide and unseeing, and fled into the darkness beyond the city gates. He did not look back. There, he fell to his knees in the dirt, his fingernails digging deep into the dry earth. He began to feed on the grass. The sun rose over the plains, casting long, sharp shadows across the dry, cracked earth. Nebuchadnezzar lay in the tall grass, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. He had spent months in this state, his senses tuned only to the wind and the hunt. But as the first light of dawn touched his face, the fog that had clouded his mind for so long began to thin. He did not move at first. He lay still, watching the light shift across the horizon. Slowly, he raised his head. He looked at his own hands, calloused and stained by the soil, and then he tilted his neck back to gaze into the vast, open sky. The frantic, animal instinct that had driven his every movement for months vanished, replaced by a sudden, piercing clarity. He stood up, his joints stiff from the cold, and drew a deep, steady breath that filled his lungs with clean air. He acknowledged the Most High, the one whose kingdom is everlasting. In that moment, the madness dissolved. He was a man restored. Time passed, and the throne of Babylon shifted hands. Belshazzar took the seat of power, but the weight of the empire did not humble him. It only fueled a reckless, growing vanity. He commanded a feast that would echo through the halls of the palace, a night of excess meant to display his absolute control. The air in the great banquet hall grew thick, with the scent of roasted meat and heavy fermented wine. Hundreds of nobles and concubines filled the space, their laughter bouncing off the gold-leafed walls as the music reached a fever pitch. Belshazzar sat at the head of the long table, his face flushed with drink, his eyes darting with a restless, arrogant energy. He wanted more than just wine. He wanted to prove his dominance over the gods of the nations he had conquered. He snapped his fingers, and his servants hurried to obey. He ordered them to bring the gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem. As the heavy, sacred cups were placed upon the table, the king reached out with a trembling, wine-stained hand and gripped one. He raised it high, shouting a toast to his own gods of metal and stone. The guests cheered, clinking the holy vessels against their own, the sound of metal ringing out like a challenge. They drank, they mocked, and they reveled in their perceived invincibility, unaware that the pride of the empire had reached its final, breaking point. The revelry was at its peak. The hall vibrated with the rhythmic thumping of drums and the shrill laughter of the guests. The Lenja, Ami. Belshazzar leaned back, his goblet raised, ready to call for another round of wine. when the air in the room suddenly turned frigid. The torches flickering along the walls dimmed, their flames turning a sickly, pale blue. The music faltered, then died away as a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Every eye turned toward the plastered wall behind the king. A disembodied hand, detached from any arm or torso, emerged from the empty air. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its fingers tracing glowing, jagged characters into the stone. The king froze. The goblet slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. But he did not seem to hear the sound. His face drained of all color, turning a ghostly, ash-like gray. His knees knocked together, the sound audible in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted, leaving him gasping for air. The hand finished the final stroke and vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the pulsating, luminous script etched into the masonry. Belshazzar screamed for his magicians and astrologers, but they stood paralyzed, unable to decipher the glowing characters. The king's voice cracked, offering robes of purple and chains of gold to any who could explain the omen. Then, the doors opened. Daniel stepped into the hall. He was an old man now, his movements slow but deliberate, his gaze steady as he walked past the trembling nobles. The king reached out, desperate. But Daniel did not look at the offered riches. He looked only at the wall. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the king's ragged breathing. Daniel stood before the glowing script, his voice clear and resonant. He told the king that his father had been humbled for his pride, yet Belshazzar had ignored those lessons. He had lifted himself against the Lord of Heaven. Daniel pointed to the wall. The words were clear. Mene, Tekel, Peres. He spoke the meaning plainly. The king had been weighed on the scales of justice and found wanting. His empire was divided, its time finished, its glory stripped away. The finality of Daniel's words had barely settled when the first tremor shook the palace floor. It was not an earthquake, but the rhythmic, thunderous impact of battering rams against the city gates. The revelry that had defined the night turned instantly into a frantic scramble for survival. Outside, the river Euphrates had been diverted, leaving the water gates vulnerable to the encroaching Persian army. Soldiers surged through the gaps, their steel blades glinting in the moonlight, as they poured into the streets like a rising tide. Within the banquet hall, the nobles dropped their goblets and fled, but the exits were already blocked. The heavy bronze doors groaned, buckled, and then shattered inward under the force of the assault. Dust and stone chips rained down from the ceiling. Belshazzar stood alone on the dais, his eyes wide as the shadows of the invaders lengthened across the floor. There was no time for negotiation, no time for defense. The empire was dismantled in a single brutal stroke. A blade flashed, the king fell. The torches were extinguished, leaving the hall in darkness. The dust of the fallen empire settled, and a new administration rose under King Darius. Daniel, despite his age, was appointed as one of the 3 administrators overseeing the kingdom. His efficiency was unmatched, his integrity absolute. He handled the affairs of the state with such precision that he quickly surpassed his peers. This success did not go unnoticed. The other governors and satraps watched from the shadows, their eyes narrow and their minds sharp with resentment. They scoured his records, searching for a single error, a hint of corruption, or a lapse in judgment. They found nothing. Daniel's work was flawless. Realizing that no professional fault could be used against him, they shifted their strategy toward his private life. They knew of his devotion to his God, a habit as constant as the rising sun. They gathered in secret, weaving a web of legislation designed to turn his faith into a death sentence. They approached the king with a proposal, masking their malice behind a facade of loyalty. They convinced Darius to issue a royal decree. For 30 days, no one could petition any god or man except the king himself. Anyone who violated this order would be cast into the den of lions. The king, blinded by their flattery, signed the document into law. The trap was set, the ink was dry, and the rivals waited in the silence of the palace, watching for the first sign of defiance. The decree reached Daniel's house before the sun had even begun to set. A royal herald read the proclamation in the square, his voice echoing against the stone walls. Daniel listened from his doorway, his expression unchanged. He knew the intent behind the words, and he knew the men who had whispered them into the king's ear. He stepped back inside and closed the door, but he did not bolt it. He walked through his rooms, the floorboards creaking under his weight, until he reached the upper chamber. Outside, in the narrow alleyway, he could hear the faint scuff of boots against gravel. The rivals were there, huddled in the shadows, waiting for the sound of a shutter. Daniel approached the window facing west. He gripped the heavy wooden frame and pushed it wide open. The evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He did not look down at the men hiding in the dark. He did not hesitate. He knelt on the stone floor, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He turned his face toward the horizon, toward the ruins of the city he had never forgotten. He began to pray, his voice steady and clear, carrying through the open window. He made no attempt to hide, no attempt to whisper. He simply spoke, and in that moment, the trap was fully sprung. The rivals did not wait for the prayer to end. They burst through the door, seized Daniel, and dragged him through the city streets to the palace. Darius paled, realizing his manipulation. His own law turned into a weapon against his most trusted advisor. He spent the entire day searching for a way to rescind the decree, his brow furrowed, his fingers gripping the armrests of his throne until his knuckles turned white. But the law of the Medes and Persians was absolute. And, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the rivals returned, their voices sharp with impatience. The king had no choice. He ordered the guards to take Daniel to the pit. They marched him to the edge of the city, where a massive circular opening was carved into the bedrock. The smell of raw meat and musk rose from the depths. Daniel was pushed forward, his feet sliding on the loose grit at the rim. He fell into the darkness, the air whistling past him, until he hit the floor. Around him, the shadows shifted. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the stone floor. Above, the heavy stone slab ground into place, sealing the entrance. The darkness was thick, smelling of stale earth and predators. A lion lunged, its claws scraping sparks against the stone floor, but the strike never landed. A sudden, blinding radiance flooded the pit, cutting through the gloom like a blade. It did not come from a torch or a lamp, but from a presence that materialized in the center of the den. The lions recoiled, their ears flattened against their skulls, their aggressive snarls dying into whimpers. The messenger stood between Daniel and the beasts, a figure of silent, overwhelming authority. The air in the pit grew still, the oppressive weight of the stone ceiling replaced by a calm that defied the subterranean setting. Daniel watched as the largest lion, its mane matted with dirt, lowered its head and pressed its belly against the cold rock. They circled the messenger and Daniel, their movements fluid and docile, eventually curling up in the corners of the pit like domestic dogs. He felt the warmth of the messenger's presence radiating outward, turning the tomb of his execution into a sanctuary. The first light of dawn touched the horizon when King Darius reached the den. He had not slept. His hands trembled as he approached the stone slab that sealed the pit. He did not wait for his guards. Hamara, he threw his weight against the rock, his voice cracking as he shouted into the darkness. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to save you from the lions? Daniel. The silence from below was absolute. The king gripped the edge of the stone, his knuckles white, his breath hitching in his chest. Then, a voice rose from the depths, steady and clear. O king, live forever. My God sent his messenger and shut the lions' mouths. Darius signaled his men. They heaved against the massive slab, the stone grinding and scraping against the bedrock until it finally slid free. Sunlight poured into the pit, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Daniel stood in the center of the den, his posture upright, his gaze fixed on the opening. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, and climbed out of the pit. He stood before the king, not a single scratch on his skin. Empires rose and fell like tides against the shore. The golden gates of Babylon, once the envy of the world, succumbed to the slow grind of time and the weight of new conquerors. The ziggurats weathered, the stone cracked, and the names of the kings who once commanded the earth faded into the dust of history. Through every shift in power, through every change of throne, Daniel remained. He was a constant in a world of flux, a witness to the fragility of human ambition. Kings fell, pride shattered. His will stood firm. He stood at the end of his days, a man who had navigated the furnace, the den, and the shifting loyalties of courts, with his focus unchanged. His life became a bridge between the transient nature of earthly kingdoms and the enduring sovereignty of the Most High. The ruins of the ancient world now lie buried beneath the sand, but the truth he lived remains. It is a testament that echoes across the centuries. Those who anchor their lives in the God of heaven are never truly alone. The empires are gone, the kings are dust, but the faith that sustained him stands.